Hello and welcome. In this episode, I'm going to learn all about Necrons, which I got to tell you, I was totally unfamiliar with them, besides the fact that they look really cool, like weird space robots. They shoot a lot of stuff, and they have really cool vehicles. But I've recently read The Infinite and the Divine by Robert Rath, and from what I've learned, it's a big fan favorite. It's a really interesting book. It goes very in depth on the sort of back and forth between two rival Necrons over thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And it taught me a ton, so let's get right down to it. So right off the bat, let's talk about Necrons. And I've only read one book, so bear in mind I'll probably get some of this wrong, and I had to infer a little bit else. But you can read this book without knowing a ton about Necrons and just sort of get to know them through this. So anyway, they're an ancient race, like more ancient than the Eldari, which are like space elves. And elves are always an ancient race in every sort of mythos. So you get a sense here that they go way, 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 way back. And they once dominated the galaxy. But essentially they had like cancer and other illness issues. So they built up these massive dynasties, but each of their leaders was like very short-lived. Actually, the whole race was. So they would like burn brightly in this short matter of time, but always be passing on the dynasty or empire to a new person. But eventually they made this deal with the Catan, I think they are, for these new immortal bodies, but they sort of got betrayed in the process and got turned not completely mindless, pretty mindless. They got betrayed, enslaved, essentially. They eventually fought back and won. But after all of that ancient conflict, a lot of them had to go into slumber. Essentially, they're Egyptian pharaohs in space. They have these big dynasties that own whole planets or systems, and these dynasties, they don't always get along. While Necrons on the surface, strive for the continuance and dominance of the whole race, there's tons of infighting that goes on. They have a bunch of wild laws and strictures to sort of manage that so that the whole of the race can continue. But they don't necessarily all play nicely with each other 24/7. Now, Necrons have some pretty crazy technology that they wield. So crazy that it often looks like magic. It can be hard to tell. They have these things called stasis fields that they use a lot. When a Necron decides to sleep for 10,000 years, they go into a stasis field, which basically it's like chronomancy technology that stops time for whatever's in this small space within this field. So if you wanted to just like chill out, get some rest, wake up in the future, you would go into one of these stasis fields, which is what a lot of them do. And they can sort of wake up these Necrons. There's always some that are, I was going to say alive. There's some that are conscious, that have the duty of like waking up some of the old sleepers from time to time when it's important, like for a legal case, for example. But they also use these stasis fields and chronomancy at large in like weapons and tactics, and they can preserve things for long periods of time because there's this tiny space where time just doesn't move forward. So you could even take, a true living creature, put it in there, and it doesn't starve. It doesn't decay, it doesn't age. And so this is like pretty wild stuff. They have some absolutely crazy weapons, some of which utterly destroy matter or kind of unmake things. They don't rely on common stuff like bullets or shurikens. Every single weapon they have is just truly devastating. Their bodies are made out of this stuff called necrodermis, which is a sort of weird, very durable, kind of like metal, but very moldable. Almost if you took like a grillion nanomachines and had them just at a cellular level sort of bind up. So they can morph things. They can craft with this necrodermis in a very machine-like way. Their bodies are made out of it. And so when you shoot one of these things to the point where it's taken so much damage that it can't really fight back, it can rebuild itself. If you think about it as like cellular machinery, that's pretty powerful. It gives them this mystique, and justifiably so, of being truly not just immortal, but eternal. They don't rely on biological systems, so there is no aging. But because they could sort of take their parts when they're damaged and put them back together and remold them, it's not like they go and get a wrench out and replace a carburetor. It just reforms in its proper functioning way. Really interesting stuff. It's like necromancy in a true fantasy sense, and these guys are very much like, Egyptian pharaohs, big warriors that are standing at attention at doorways for centuries till someone finally shows up, and then like very much like a mummy come out and just beat the daylights out of stuff. They've got a lot of imagery around that too, with scarabs and weaponry, and just how they're built does harken back to ancient Egyptian visuals, but it's necromancy, but it's all tech. And as characters, they're often like, I'll say, over-indexed on themselves. They're caricatures of who they are when they were living. So you can imagine if you were to take your consciousness and put it in a machine, your consciousness is now subject to sort of the rules of how computers work. So you're all processors rather than neurons. And so while they still have personalities, they don't come off of a production line. Their souls were crafted into these new bodies. So they have a history, some of which they remember, but it's been so long, and this transition shakes some things up. But if there was a sort of personality type or a hobby or a fixation that you had in life, that is sort of like a constant subroutine that's running for you, a fixation once you're in one of these necrodermis bodies as a modern Necron. Their memory is near perfect, but not perfect. Kind of like a machine computer that has sections of memory that kind of go bad. Like, they don't just randomly forget things, that's for sure. They can store massive amounts of data. They can process massive amounts of data, but they've been around for nearly forever, and some things just sort of get defragged out, and then once again that line that they crossed between being mortal and being put in these bodies, some of the stuff from their mortal days is pretty shady, because now it's a computer processor trying to make sense of what was mortal consciousness. And this part makes them very, very cool. Their ability to enjoy life was sort of, in some ways, not completely, sort of sucked away. A lot of their joie de vivre when they made this transition. But this book absolutely shows that they're still characters with weird quirks and flaws and fixations, and they have emotions, but it's always sort of through the filter of a really advanced computer system running a human consciousness. So it's not the same thing as AI, where it's trying to figure out, I'm a baby, I got to learn to crawl. It's more like you found the perfect machine and then shunted a consciousness into it. And so now everything has to line up as ones and zeros, and it has these little strange, interesting effects. For example, and the book does a great job of just putting these little moments in. Their machines, they overheat. Now, they overheat from stress, from over-processing things, from physical activity, and while they're timeless and they can kind of just at a normal pace, even a fast pace for a human being, they can just walk forever. That's fine. But in combat and under the stress of trying to process this massive amounts of data, they'll leak coolant sometimes. Sometimes they'll get condensation going on in weird places, because at the end of the day, they are machines, and they're masterfully crafted and can self-repair. But the book does this beautiful job of, in these little moments, translating what are very much biofeedback things from a person into what it would be like as this machine running around with this crazy computer inside of it. Now, a lot of Necrons, like, are relatively sane. They've made this change and they continue on, and they have, pretty sinister agendas, at least from a humanist perspective, because they pretty much want to take over the whole universe again. They're still kind of who they were, but some of them just go nuts and are just these crazed killers that get kept, I'm guessing, in stasis until they're needed to be used as a weapon. So you can imagine that circumstance of like a mummy that eventually is just like out to kill the living. You keep it in a sarcophagus until intruders come in, or you wheel it out and just let these things go nuts. But most of them, are still sentient. Some of them aren't so smart. Some of them have a little less processing power, and they can be sort of networked together as like platoons and legions of soldiers that are essentially through space Wi-Fi programmed in real time to like take combat actions. So in a lot of cases you'll have like a senior officer or like a pharaoh or lord or whatever who's got just like rows and rows of riflemen. Obviously the man part of that's not real. Or like melee fighters, and they can command these huge groups in real time through just the raw use of processing power and command signals and sending AI routines to these massive groups. And finally, like another really cool thing is that their brains are computers that they are aware of and can utilize like a computer that has multiple cores and processors and different banks of memory and things like that. So, the phrase walk and chew gum, they could do things like that. Obviously they can walk and chew gum, but they can set something on like a low-level process somewhere to just run in the background, potentially for infinity. Like, here's an example. Like if they wanted to try to calculate pi out to as far as it's ever been done before, they could just take a part of their brain and just let it run on that while they do all kinds of other stuff, build pottery, wage war, write poems, and just like pi will just be going out place by place in the background. And truly prolific Necrons could do this a lot. They can wield that processing power when focused to like great effect, where in this case, their sub-process would be just like making sure that they're paying attention to their surroundings so they don't get jumped. But meanwhile, like solving an absolutely ridiculous, like interspace travel math problem, and just cook on it, and take like 100 years, if they felt like it, to just sit there and keep processing. So time to them is very different than it is to people. They sort of look down on the short-lived mortal races a lot. It's for them, it's like this legacy that they have to just be eternal, and they use it. They will think of things to do, like if they're having a trial, which there is a trial, or at least a hearing in this book. Like, yeah, it might go on for a decade. That's fine. Everyone can have their time to speak. They can take long breaks. Someone can process some crazy astronomical amount of data to use it as evidence. So they're sentiently aware and can wield their computer brains for what they are, which is totally cool. Like in terms of a fantasy thing to think about, like imagine if you could just plan something complex, like plan someone's wedding, something that's just a nightmare thing of tasks to do. You could just plan someone's wedding in the background while you're going around doing your job, or go to Six Flags, or do whatever. Like you're sitting there eating lunch, and you don't have to focus on it. You just have it cooking. Now, because this is conscious effort and they understand how they operate, there's a little bit of downside to it, or some quirks around it. They can tend to fixate on like loops of behavior. So if there's something you like, or something that's part of what makes you who you are as a Necron, you tend to do it, and then do it again, and do it again. Not out of obsession necessarily, though in this book there's a little bit, it borders on that. More just like maybe there's just some process running in the background that is high level, governing all the things that you do just a little bit, that kind of brings you back to the same behaviors over and over and over again. So that's probably enough to go on, was for me, in terms of understanding Necrons, to really get into the story. And it's a fun one. And at a very high level, it's about these two Necrons. One is named Trazyn and the other one Orikan. And they are from different dynasties, different political groups. But they're both very good at what each one of them does. So to start off, Trazyn is basically like a klepto museum curator. He collects artifacts. The planet on which he lives is being constantly built out with bigger and bigger and more museum rooms. And some of these rooms are massive, like in the kilometers size. And when I said like not necessarily an obsession, this guy seems to, his whole thing is just going out into the universe, collecting artifacts, creatures, whole ships, just crazy stuff, and bringing it back to this museum, sort of to serve as this cultural understanding history for Necrons to be able to visit, like when and learn about what's happened while all of these Necrons are in stasis, in sleep for tens of thousands of years. So he's just got these robots just continually adding rooms. He knows he'll fill them. It's just this, speaking of loops, just like, go, just keep building, I'll tell you when to stop, and he never does. He's kind of like Indiana Jones, but instead of that whole, like, it belongs in a museum, he's really like, it belongs in my museum. And he builds massive stasis dioramas. At one point, some craziness goes on in the museum, and there's a diorama that's like a battle between some orcs with a whole ship in there and some other guys, and like the stasis fields go down, and there's like, it's like time just starts up again. And these orcs aren't where they were when they were fighting before, because now they're in this museum, but of course they're orcs and they're awesome, so they just get like right down to it again. They just start fighting. There's guys flying around on rockets. There's a bit of ship combat. It's really interesting when you think about a museum as like, what if a space pharaoh was running it? Trazyn is very single-minded in his desire to collect things. The ends always justify the means. He gets in a little bit of trouble here and there, actually a lot of trouble here and there, but he's always telling himself that it's like for the good of his people's legacy. But he really can't help himself, and he doesn't respect other cultures' boundaries, and he sort of kind of laughs about it, and he's exceedingly powerful. He's got really dope toys. He's got these like stasis, almost Pokeballs that can capture living things and sock them away. So when he goes out, into the galaxy to like go collect stuff, he could go up to some, warrior fighting in the middle of a battle, and rather than like take a picture and try to, build a diorama or like shoot an animal and then do taxidermy on it, he just throws the Pokeball thing out and just the thing's in stasis, and he's going to bring it to a stasis room for a diorama. So it's actually like a person or a creature that's just like out of poor luck happened to get, like most Pokemon, out of poor luck, get put in a ball and then will later be used for someone's entertainment. He can transport massive objects, vehicles, as I said before, like whole ships, you name it. Like he goes and gets these things. Basically, he's just stealing historical artifacts. He goes to the Istvan 5 drop zone and collects Space Marine gear. And he actually cites like the Horus Heresy as like a really interesting time to be collecting stuff. The book starts before the Horus Heresy, goes into like, I think the 40k era, but it's like right around that time with the Horus Heresy was going nuts. Like that was a great time to be essentially a museum curator, which is really neat to think about. They're so elevated that they think about the core mythos that we all care so much about as just being like this little flash in the pan time that spat out really interesting stuff. Trazyn has this weapon. It's like a scepter or a staff, and it's called an empathic obliterator. And I wanted to make sure I got that right. And it's just like massively powerful. It unmakes matter. It really is like devastating. It can sort of unmake magics, wards that protect things. So it's like a very heavy-handed way for him to break into places that have been warded up with all this crazy magic. And yeah, he may have to solve some Indiana Jones-like traps and things, which he can do because he can just sit there and think about them and do a bunch of processing. But like a lot of times when he's just got to get through a door, it doesn't matter if some race that lived for 4,000 years that came up with all this interesting technology and magic and put all these runes on the door, he'll just knock the thing and walk right in. So you figure, with these Pokeballs and this staff thing, he can get a lot done collecting artifacts around the galaxy. He has this other ability as well to sort of pull an Agent Smith, and so he could have like 2 Necron buddies with him that are just kind of like drone soldiers, and he can move, he can Wi-Fi his consciousness over to another one, leaving his old body behind, and then because it's made out of this necrodermis, he can reform it to just be him now. So other Necrons that are around him, as long as they're not like higher level consciousness, he could just jump into them, which he uses quite often in combat. You catch him off guard, you run him through with a sword, he's leaking out a bunch of oil and stuff, and he just looks over at some other line soldier and just zips his brain over, rebuilds the body so it looks as cool as him. You just got to go back and grab his empathic obliterator, and he just keeps on cooking. And at one point, I think he actually builds he's splits his consciousness amongst several clones. So there's 8 of him running around doing stuff. It's just wild. And he's a really funny character. He's got a sense of humor, even though it's been tamped down a bit now that he's a space robot pharaoh-ish guy. But he's really cool, and I just love him. I absolutely love him. I've ordered his model. I have to paint it and not un-Trazyn put it in my shelf, my diorama of stuff, so he could be there. So I love him. Trazyn has a rival in this book, this guy Orikan, who is a chronomancer from a different dynasty. And Orikan is a very, very different person. He's not a fan of the past. He scoffs at it. He's a chronomancer. He's obsessed with reading and manipulating the future. And he's got some pretty awesome abilities. He can see, sometimes choose different futures. He essentially can command a rewind button on things where if things don't go his way, within limits, he can sort of rewind a few minutes. Generally, he only does it a few seconds, but sometimes a few minutes. I think at one point during the trial in this book, he's rewinding it a lot. And it has some costs. Other people, especially Necrons around, can sort of get a sense of it. They get that Matrix kind of I feel like I've done this before. But obviously, with that ability, he's immensely powerful. Imagine if you were walking down the street and some guy jumped around the corner and was give me all your money, and he stabs you immediately, and you're wait a second, let me just rewind a few minutes, and then you walk back down that street and you know what happened, but that guy is coming Groundhog Day, doesn't know that you know right now, and so you already got your hands up ready for a fight, and then he stabs you anyway, so you're I'm gonna rewind it again, maybe 5 minutes, and then you just take a different street and never see the guy, and you just walk on your merry way. Think about that in battle. Anytime you get hit, you just kind of hit the rewind button real quick, just sort of take a step over here or lean a bit this way, get a few inches further out of the range of someone taking a swing at you with something terrible. It's really, really interesting, and the book uses it a lot. Orikan uses it a lot, regularly. It's his jam, so it's not some it's got some risk to it, but not enough to stop him from it being a part of his everyday life. Orikan can also, he's a chronomancer and has a computer brain, a supercomputer brain. He can calculate and traverse like massive amounts of probability data to make a very good conjecture about what might happen in the future. And we're talking like centuries in the future. So if you think about someone who was a psyker, and they're getting, we talked about astropaths in one episode, like they're getting all these weird sort of images, and they have to sort of sift, not sort of, they absolutely have to sift through all this warp imagery to try to piece together what might happen or what might be being communicated. Well, for Orikan, like he can sift as many things as he needs to get increasingly accurate information. And it never really says that he's like tapping into the warp at all to do this. I don't think that he is. But if you take that sort of concept to the nth degree, and he is a machine chronomancer, so there's some ways that are sort of magic-like that he gets insights. He could sit there, for 60 years, sort of meditating, processing on what might happen several hundred years from now, or like have a question where he's like, very specifically in the book, he's like, when does this vault open? When's the next time it does? When do the stars align in this specific way next so that this can happen? And he could just sit there and ponder it, just cooking his processors. And because he's a chronomancer, if he sits down for 60 years, his chronomancer stuff means he might actually be processing for 1,000 years. It's just 60 years of real time bent in an interesting way. So, and he does this. Like he can, for very specific things, just take the time that he needs to make a wild conjecture about when something very specific is going to happen. And because Necrons live so long and this rivalry between he and Trazyn is going on for so long, a lot of times he does that. And eventually, when you're about a third to halfway through the book, you come to expect that Orikan will just be there ready and waiting sometimes where it's absolutely the most opportune, because that's what he does in his spare time. Like, he never shows up at the wrong time because he gets to pick. Now, the rivalry between Trazyn and Orikan starts at the very beginning of the book, where Trazyn has this pretty powerful, amongst many, artifact. He's got this artifact set up in his museum, and his little alarm goes off, and he goes to check on it, and Orikan is in there, like, stealing this thing, and they have a big fight, and you've got Trazyn with this obliterator weapon that is extremely dangerous, like, taking these swings, and Orikan sort of always being out of the way right on time. And Orikan doesn't respect the past, so he's just like pushing over display pieces in poor Trazyn's museum. He's freaking out of like this vase. It's like the last vase from some weird Xenos race dynasty while they're fighting. And Orikan pieces out. They have this big fight, but Orikan like takes off with the thing. Now the thing in question is called the Astrarium Mysterios, and even as Orikan sort of describes it, it's like a puzzle box. Yeah, puzzle box, celestial compass, key. Depending on who you believed, it might be any of these things. That's a quote from, I think, chapter 1. And he's in there because there's this puzzle box key thing that he needs to look into the future and to find out stuff that's important to his personal gains. And it's a really fun fight. It's very much a verbal tete-a-tete. And they don't talk like robots. They talk like two rivals that really don't like each other. At one point, so this is also from chapter 1. Orikan's speaking while they're just right before they're about to fight. He goes, "I prefer to look to the future to navigate the future. For instance, there were 27 times I could have attacked just now, but none would have gotten past your guard." Trazyn goes, "Indeed?" And Orikan responds, "But 28 is the slaying blow," and then takes a swing at him. So like their fights are fun. They're interesting. They spar verbally. They talk trash to each other. They insult each other. Like, even when they first see each other, the way that they bow is like, I bow to you as an equal, but not so far down that it's not a little bit insulting. It's really an interesting rivalry, and has way more character than I thought it would with my limited knowledge of Necrons. Like, they do have personality in there. They don't communicate it to humans ever. They just kind of look like these, marching robo-skeletons. But amongst themselves, where they care about these things, those ancient sort of rivalries and snark, they're really very much three-dimensional characters. Now, the other little funny part about their exchange and their trash talking is at one point Orikan says, "You stole it first, the Ammunos dynasty." And Trazyn's response is like perfectly encapsulates his character. He says, "The Ammunos dynasty is naught but inert metal now. You can't steal from the dead. That's called archaeology. The point is to memorialize, learn, study from what came before us. We look to the past to navigate the future." Now, I'm not going to spoil the entirety of the book, but let's just say from this point on, the feud is on. And I'll sort of walk you through sort of the arcs that it goes through. Trazyn obviously wants his artifact back. It belongs in his museum. He doesn't think he stole it, but he does think it's his to put on display. And so they attack back and forth. Sometimes the thing changes hands. Eventually, the authorities, there's like a tribunal of like elder Necrons that has to keep things somewhat civil, so there's not a massive, crazy civil war happening while a bunch of these pharaohs are still asleep. Eventually, there's a trial. It's sort of all of this like, hey, how did you get this thing in the first place? It's like, can you steal from someone who stole? What are these ancient laws about property and how are they arbitrated? Orikan sort of fixes the trial because they have to pick a central arbiter. They have to wake up an old pharaoh to like sit there and listen to this as like an impartial arbiter. And the first one that gets chosen, the argument goes Trazyn's way. So Orikan just rewinds the beginning and moves the discussion of who to pick as an arbiter in a different direction so that they get a different old pharaoh Necron to oversee the arguments, and that one doesn't quite go there. And finally, I think it's the third one, it finally works, but Orikan just basically rewinds the trial till it finally goes in his favor, which is amazing. Of course, neither of these two are really ethically pure, so the rivalry and feud continues, and eventually they get pulled up by this tribunal again, and they're like, hey, you're kind of breaking this whole thing. They're both trying to figure out what's going on this weird planet as they both do their research on this artifact and what it's supposed to unlock. There's this planet that they go to several times over thousands of years. Like, different races live on it over the course of the story. And, they're both trying to figure out this mystery of there's this code coming from this planet. It has to do with this very important Necron dynasty. They think it might be this dynasty that no one heard about for a while. There's this very famous old Necron who I think never, I think his whole thing was he never got sick, and I don't think he ever there's something about him that's just super important, and he rose up and basically is what helped the Necrons break free of their overlords. And so the idea that maybe his tomb's on this world is a pretty big deal. So they both show up there and start doing research, and Trazyn does it as an archaeologist. Orikan does it as a astromancer, chronomancer guy. But eventually the tribunal's like, yo, I thought we were going to put this to bed. You didn't put it to bed. So now you're both in trouble. And so they go through all these arguments of the importance of the artifact and what it may open historically, and the tribunal's like, all right, well, here's your punishment. Now you guys got to work together to get this thing open. Which sort of gets us, I think, into about Act 3 of the book. After they've been beating the daylights out of each other over centuries and millennia, now they're forced to work together on this planet, which is now at this point, it's gone through a very primitive age, and there was Eldari and all sorts of crazy, fantastic Xenos creatures on this planet to that whole society died off somewhat with the intervention of Trazyn and Orikan and all the stuff that they were doing, kind of as a result of one of their battles on the planet in long ago history, to the point where it's eventually settled by Terrans. Enough time goes by where the Terran, the Emperor's empire, comes into prominence, and these people, these soldiers and citizens of the Empire find this planet. Nothing's really troubling living on it, and they populate it. And over time, they start filling in the place. Meanwhile, Trazyn and Orikan are underground most of the time, though they spend some time above ground, and they can just kind of hide in plain sight. But they watch history happen there, and it's really, really cool. And now they still don't like each other. There's still a very high likelihood that they're going to backstab each other, but they get closer and closer and closer to teasing out the mystery of this vault. And it requires both of their sets of talents to be able to get further and further on this grand, Indiana Jones task to find the tomb, to get it open, to find out what's inside. Eventually, they do crack the vault open, and as you might have guessed, everything is not what it seems. It's a trap. And there's a massive battle that ensues in this vault, which is just huge, big enough for vehicles to be zipping around with no problem. And Trazyn and Orikan are forced to fight together as a team and really push themselves to the limits. But also, with how different they are, they bring their unique strengths to bear. And at one point, it's a really interesting quote from the book. Is when they get a sense of exactly how it's going to go down, and it's going to be this massive fight, this exchange happens. Orikan stole a glance away from the battle management panels that hung before him in the air. "I hope you brought an army." And Trazyn responds, "You think so little of me, dear colleague." "I brought 5. So they really do team up in epic fashion. Trazyn is just pouring armies out of stasis, unleashing them like Pokemon. And it's in this exotic mix of, things that he's had essentially on ice. There's exotic creatures, there's peoples from different cultures that all just sort of get zorched into this boss fight. And Orikan, on his part, he manages tactics, strategy, and time for the Necron army that they have, and he's seamlessly using chronomancy to pick out the best movements, feints, and attacks, and he's managing this massive Necron force to operate as this crazy coordinated, almost die roll defying army. And here's where we get to a really important thing for me in this book, and it's where I call the book a love letter to Wargamers, is that while the plot of the story is some pretty awesome, 40K romp around with interesting twists and turns, there's great battles in it, there's a lot of great lore in it, there's tons of Necron goodness that puts their race in context, helps you understand why they are the way they are. But, it's a big but, the characters of Orikan and Trazyn really are an allegory for two very clear aspects of us as wargamers. You see, as I've been getting up to speed learning about this game and the universe and all that comes with it, I find myself pulled in two directions for inspiration. I clearly like collecting and curating miniatures. I paint them, glue them together, obviously not in that order, well, sometimes, but I set them up in little scenes. I feel this compulsion to get more minis, not because I need them, but because the accumulation of them is in and of itself delightful. The more I have, the better my little scene gets, and I don't foresee ever thinking I'm done collecting these. And as I'm getting closer to finishing up painting my Death Guard army, my thoughts are already churning on what army I will paint next. Does that sound like someone? Now, the other direction I'm pulled in for inspiration is the desire to know everything about the game, the meta, the strategy, and how to win. Like, how does someone maximize the rules, find combinations, compute the best outcome? sounds a little bit like someone else. And so, personally, I'm a little more Trazyn than Orikan right now. So I'm most interested in playing at least well with this army of little army men that I've lovingly painted. But I think you can probably take a look at any number of people that play 40k and kind of put them on this scale between Trazyn and Orikan, and you meet people that are absolutely way over on one side or another. So you'll see gamers that, and even websites and communities where the rules are important to play the game, but really it's about painting and collecting. And some people so extreme they never play the game; they just collect and paint minis, which is awesome. And then you'll see other areas of the internet and people that at this point, they don't go to the store, buy a model, glue it together, paint it again. They'll just go buy an army that is ready to rock, which is also cool because then for them it's like about getting into the game and playing as many scenarios, running through as many timelines as possible, and really learning how to maximize their play. And then obviously, there's a bunch of places you can go and people you meet where they're somewhere in the middle. And I think that's really, really cool, and a huge part of why this game and its overall community is super interesting. And I think this sort of Trazyn Orikan scale is most recently manifest if you think about when 10th edition came out. And let's just say that some armies were better than others. I'll put it mildly. But, for me, who's just learning how to paint and learning the rules, I'm going on Reddit and going to all these subreddits about specific factions. And a ton of them, especially the ones where the army's rules were pretty weak, they got spicy for quite a while. But a lot of the sort of misunderstandings were a lot of these subreddits, people like me are posting pictures of their poxwalkers and saying, what do you think of my poxwalkers? And another contingent of people are saying, the rules are so broken, I can't play my game, and I may not be able to for months. And there's a lot of back and forth, and some people seem to care extremely deeply about the rules, and some people almost not at all, and just hey, can we all just be friends? And obviously, once again, a lot of people right down the middle. And it sort of shows that people play Warhammer for different reasons. And they get different amounts of joy out of different aspects of it. And I just think that's absolutely fantastic. Anywho, I challenge you, A, to read this book because it's dope. But B, as you hang out with people, surf the internet, think all things Warhammer, see if you can put different people and websites and posts on this scale and see if it makes more sense of why, for an amazingly passionate community, sometimes, depending on how polarized we are on one side of the Trazyn Orikan scale, people don't get along temporarily. And see how that goes. It's a lot of fun. Anyhow, that should wrap things up. I hope you've enjoyed this. You should definitely read the book if you haven't. It's very, very cool. And hopefully we'll catch up soon. Thanks a bunch. Bye-bye.